They called her a mistake. They called her a gold digger. But worst of all, they looked her in the eye and called her useless. Sarah Miller was the woman who scrubbed their floors, tolerated their insults, and loved their son, despite their cruelty. The Harrington family thought they were the kings of Newport society, untouchable in their ivory tower. They thought they could discard Sarah like yesterday's trash to save their crumbling empire. But they didn't know who she really was. They didn't know that the quiet girl at the dinner table held the deed to their entire existence. In a world where money talks, silence is the most expensive weapon of all. And Sarah. She was about to bankrupt them with a single signature. This is the story of how the useless wife became the owner of everything. The silence in the dining room of the Harrington estate was louder than any scream. It was October 14th, a Tuesday, but inside the sprawling mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, the air felt as frigid as the dead of winter. Sarah sat at the far end of the mahogany table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was wearing a simple navy dress she had bought at a department store sale. Sensible, clean, and utterly invisible compared to the shimmering silk worn by her mother-in-law, Catherine Harrington. "Bruno," Catherine said, not looking at her son, but staring critically at the rim of her crystal wine glass. "The soup is lukewarm. Did she make this?" Bruno Harrington, a man who had the jawline of a movie star, but the backbone of a jellyfish when it came to his parents, cleared his throat. He reached for Sarah's hand under the table, giving it a weak squeeze. Sarah followed the chef's recipe. "Mother, it's delicious," Bruno said, though his voice lacked conviction. At the head of the table sat Preston Harrington, the patriarch. He was a man who wore three-piece suits on Sundays and believed that net worth was directly correlated to human value. He set his spoon down with a sharp clack. "It lacks depth," Preston grumbled, "much like the conversation tonight." Sarah felt the sting, but she kept her face neutral. She had been married to Bruno for 2 years, and for 730 days, she had been the target of a Cold War. To the Harringtons, Sarah was a waitress Bruno had picked up in a diner during his rebellion phase. She was a nobody from Ohio, with no pedigree, no trust fund, and no connections. "I can ask the kitchen to reheat it, Preston," Sarah offered softly. "Don't bother," Catherine snapped, finally turning her icy blue gaze towards Sarah. "You wouldn't understand the delicacy of a bisque like this. You'd probably microwave it." A small, cruel chuckle escaped Preston's lips. The doors to the dining room opened, and the maid Maria, who looked at Sarah with sympathetic eyes, cleared the bowls. As the main course was served, the atmosphere shifted from cold to hostile. "So," Catherine began, slicing into her filet mignon, "the winter gala is approaching. The committee is finalizing the guest list. I was thinking," Bruno started, "that Sarah and I could help with the—" "Sarah isn't on the list, Bruno," Catherine interrupted smoothly, taking a sip of her Pinot Noir. Sarah froze. The Winter Gala was the Harringtons' biggest social event of the year. It was where business deals were struck and family alliances were forged. To be excluded was a public declaration that she was not part of the family. "Mother," Bruno said, his voice rising slightly. "She is my wife." "She is an embarrassment," Preston barked, slamming his hand on the table. The silverware jumped. "Do you know what the Sinclairs asked me at the club yesterday? They asked if my daughter-in-law was still taking night classes to get her GED. They think she's illiterate, Bruno." "And why? Because she sits there at functions like a mute statue." "I have a degree in art history," Sarah said, her voice shaking but clear. "And I work as an archivist. I am not illiterate." "An archivist," Catherine sneered, testing the word like it was poison. "You file papers in a dusty basement. You contribute nothing to this family's legacy. You bring no capital, no status, no influence." Catherine leaned forward, the candlelight casting long, demonic shadows across her face. "Let's be honest, dear. You are decorative at best. But even then, your taste is pedestrian. In the grand ledger of the Harrington Empire, you are a liability. You are quite simply useless." The word hung in the air. Useless. Bruno dropped his fork. "That's enough." "Is it?" Preston challenged. "Look at this house, Bruno. Look at your lifestyle. Who pays for the cars? The vacations? The roof over your head? We do. And as long as we control the purse strings, we control who sits at this table. Sarah is dead weight, and with the merger with the Sinclair Group on the horizon, we can't afford dead weight." Preston looked directly at Sarah. "If you loved him, you'd leave. You're holding him back from a future with someone who actually matters, someone like Bella Sinclair." Sarah stood up. Her legs felt weak, but she refused to cry in front of them. She looked at Bruno, waiting for him to flip the table, to scream, to drag her out of that toxic mausoleum. Bruno looked down at his plate. "Dad, please." "Not tonight. Not tonight." That was his defense. Not "how dare you," but "not tonight." Sarah turned and walked out of the dining room. As she reached the heavy oak doors, she heard Catherine's voice, intentionally loud. "See." She runs away. No breeding. No spine. Useless. Sarah walked into the foyer, grabbed her coat, and stepped out into the biting October wind. She didn't get into her modest sedan. She just walked to the edge of the driveway, looking out over the dark cliffs of Newport. She pulled her phone from her pocket. It had been buzzing for 20 minutes. A number she didn't recognize with a London area code. She wiped a tear from her cheek and answered. "This is Sarah," she whispered. "Mrs. Sarah Miller Harrington." A crisp, professional British voice answered. "This is Arthur Pendleton, senior partner at Caldwell & Moore in London. I apologize for the late hour, but it is a matter of extreme urgency regarding your grandfather." "My grandfather is dead to me," Sarah said, her voice hardening. "He died 10 years ago." "Silas Blackwood passed away this morning, Sarah," the lawyer said. "And we need to discuss the will. It seems you are the sole beneficiary." Sarah stopped breathing. Silas Blackwood wasn't just a grandfather. He was a titan of European industry, a man who owned shipping lines, steel mills, and if the rumors were true, half the debt of the American elite. "I don't want his money," Sarah said. "It's not just money, Sarah," Mr. Pendleton said, his voice dropping to a grave whisper. "It's leverage. And looking at the files regarding your husband's family businesses, I believe you're going to need it." The next morning, the Harrington household was operating with its usual sterile efficiency. Sarah had slept in the guest room. When she came down to the kitchen, Catherine was already there instructing the staff on the floral arrangements for the upcoming weekend. Catherine didn't look up from her iPad. "I expect you to be gone by noon. Bruno and I have a lunch meeting with the Sinclairs. Bella is flying in from Paris." Sarah poured herself a black coffee. The conversation with Arthur Pendleton the night before was still swirling in her mind. Sole beneficiary. The numbers he had mentioned were astronomical. Billions, not millions, billions. But the most interesting part wasn't the cash. It was the portfolio of private loans Silas Blackwood had purchased over the last 5 years. "I live here, Catherine," Sarah said calmly. "I'm not going anywhere." Catherine laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "You live here because we allow it. But the lease on your fairy tale is up. Preston is meeting with the bank this afternoon to restructure the family trust. Once that's done, Bruno's allowance will be tied to his marital status, specifically to him being single." Sarah took a sip of coffee. She watched her mother-in-law with a new perspective. Yesterday, Catherine looked like a queen. Today, knowing what Sarah knew, Catherine looked desperate. "Is the company in trouble, Catherine?" Sarah asked innocently. Catherine's head snapped up. "How dare you? Harrington Steel is the backbone of this state." "It's just that—" Sarah paused, feigning ignorance. "I read in the journal that steel tariffs are hurting exports, and Preston seems very stressed." "You stick to dusting your old books," Catherine spat. "Leave the finance to the adults." Just then Bruno walked in. He looked terrible eyes, red hair, messy. He looked like a man being torn in half. "Sarah," he started, "about last night. We don't need to talk about it, Bruno," she said. "Yes, we do," he insisted. He glanced at his mother, then pulled Sarah into the hallway. "Look, my parents. They are intense. But they're right about one thing. The business is shaky. We need the Sinclair merger. If we don't get their capital injection by the end of the month, Harrington Steel goes under. We lose the house. We lose everything." Sarah looked at her husband. "So what are you saying?" "You need to marry Bella Sinclair to save your daddy's company." Bruno rubbed his face. "No. I love you. But maybe we could separate, just for a while, just on paper. Until the deal goes through, Mom says if we stage a separation, the Sinclairs will sign." Sarah felt her heart shatter. It wasn't the cruelty of the parents that hurt the most. It was the cowardice of the husband. He was willing to hide her, to deny her just to keep his trust fund intact. "You want me to be your dirty little secret?" Sarah asked. "It's temporary," Bruno pleaded. "Please, Sarah, don't be selfish. Think about my family." "I am thinking about your family," Sarah said enigmatically. "More than you know." She pulled away from him. "I'm going to work." Sarah didn't go to the library. She drove her beat-up Honda Civic to a private airfield 40 minutes outside of Newport. Waiting on the tarmac was a sleek black Gulfstream jet with the insignia SB on the tail. A man in a charcoal suit stood at the stairs. He was older, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Arthur Pendleton. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, bowing slightly. "Or should I say, Miss Blackwood?" "Sarah is fine," she said, shaking his hand. They boarded the jet. The interior was unlike anything the Harringtons owned. It was understated luxury, cream leather, rare wood, no flashy gold. Arthur opened a leather briefcase. "As we discussed, your grandfather, Silas, had been estranged from your mother because she refused to marry into royalty. He regretted that distance in his final years. He followed your life closely, Sarah. He knew you were struggling. He knew how the Harringtons treated you." Arthur slid a thick file across the table. "He wanted you to have the option to burn it all down, or to save it. The choice is yours." Sarah opened the file. The first document was a promissory note. Borrower Harrington Global Holdings. Lender Blackwood Private Equity. Amount $150 million. Status default imminent. "They owe you," Arthur explained. "Technically, they owed your grandfather. Now they owe you. The Harringtons leveraged everything this house, the steel mills, their private island, to stay afloat 3 years ago. The loan matures in 4 days. If it isn't paid in full, you have the right to foreclose on all assets. Sarah ran her finger over the numbers. Does Preston know Blackwood Equity is me? No. Arthur smiled. Blackwood Equity is a shell company. Preston thinks he borrowed from a faceless European consortium. He has a meeting with the consortium's representative tomorrow to beg for an extension. Sarah looked out the window as the jet engines whined to life. Who is the representative? You are, Arthur said, if you want to be. Sarah closed the file. The image of Catherine's sneer and Bruno's pleading face flashed in her mind. Useless. Set up the meeting, Sarah said, but not in a boardroom. They love their social events. They love the winter gala. Let's do it there. Arthur raised an eyebrow. That's dramatic. They wanted drama. Sarah said, her eyes cold. They wanted to humiliate me at the gala. I think it's only fair I return the favor. Very well, Arthur said, taking notes. And there is one more thing. The Sinclairs. Bella Sinclair is arriving today. I know, Sarah said. We did some digging on the Sinclairs, Arthur said, sliding a smaller, darker folder across. The Harringtons think the Sinclairs are their saviors. But Bella Sinclair isn't coming to merge. She's coming to liquidate. She's working with a rival developer to strip the Harrington estate for parts once the marriage is signed. Sarah laughed. It was a dark, humorless sound. So Bruno is selling his soul to a shark to save himself from drowning. Precisely. Sarah looked at the folder. Don't tell them. Not yet. You're going to let them proceed with the engagement party. I'm going to let them dig their grave, Sarah said. I want them to stand on that stage, announce their victory, and feel safe. And then, I want to turn the lights on. For the next 3 days, Sarah played the role the Harringtons had written for her, the ghost. She moved silently through the hallways of the estate, avoiding the west wing, where Bella Sinclair had taken up residence. Bella had arrived with 6 suitcases, a toy poodle named Duchess, and an air of entitlement that sucked the oxygen out of every room. From the top of the staircase, Sarah watched. She saw Catherine fawning over Bella, touching her arm, laughing at jokes that weren't funny. She saw Preston pouring vintage scotch for Bella's father, Richard Sinclair, discussing synergy and hostile takeovers. And she saw Bruno. He looked like a man on death row. He followed Bella around like a trained pet holding her purse, fetching her drinks. Whenever his eyes drifted up to the landing where Sarah stood in the shadows, he looked away quickly, shame burning his cheeks. But Sarah wasn't just watching. She was preparing. While the Harringtons were distracted with the pageantry of their impending merger, Sarah was in the city. She wasn't visiting the library. She was at the penthouse suite of the Ritz-Carlton, which Arthur Pendleton had secured as their temporary headquarters. The audit is complete, Arthur said, pacing the room on Wednesday afternoon. He pointed to a whiteboard covered in red ink. It's worse than we thought, Sarah. Preston hasn't just leveraged the business. He's embezzled from the employee pension fund to cover his gambling debts in Macau. If this comes out, he doesn't just lose the company. He goes to federal prison. Sarah stared at the board. He stole from his workers over $12 million, Arthur confirmed. He's banking on the Sinclair money to plug the hole before the quarterly audit next month. Sarah felt a cold fury settle in her chest. She had thought this was just about their cruelty to her. Now she realized it was about their cruelty to everyone. They were parasites wrapped in silk. What about the gala? Sarah asked. The stage is set, Arthur said, a mischievous glint in his eye. I sent a courier to Preston this morning, a formal letter from Blackwood Equity. It states that the senior director will be attending the Winter Gala personally to finalize the decision on the loan foreclosure. How did he react? Panic, Arthur replied. Pure panic. He's trying to impress the Sinclairs to get their money, but now he has to host the very creditor who holds the axe over his neck. He's terrified that if the Blackwood representative reveals the debt in front of the Sinclairs, the merger will die. Good, Sarah whispered. Now, Arthur said, clapping his hands. We have business to attend to. If you are going to walk into that gala as the owner of Blackwood Equity, you cannot look like Sarah the archivist. You need to look like Sarah the heiress. Sarah stood up. I don't want to look like them, Arthur. I don't want to look like old money that smells like mothballs and judgment. I want to look like justice. The transformation began. It wasn't just a makeover. It was the construction of armor. Sarah spent the afternoon at a private atelier in Boston, a place that didn't have a sign on the door and only served clients by referral. There were no price tags. She chose a dress that was the antithesis of the pastel, frilly things Catherine usually forced her to wear. It was a floor-length gown of midnight blue velvet, dark enough to look black in low light, with a structure that was sharp, modern, and dangerous. It had a plunging back and a neckline that demanded confidence. When she stepped out of the dressing room, the tailor, a stern Frenchwoman, nodded once. C'est une arme, she murmured. It is a weapon. On the morning of the gala, the tension in the Harrington house was palpable. Preston was screaming into his phone in the study. Catherine was terrorizing the catering staff. Sarah walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water. Bella Sinclair was there eating a grapefruit. She looked Sarah up and down with a sneer. So, Bella said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. Bruno tells me you're moving out next week. Back to Ohio, is it? Sarah poured her water calmly. Is that what he said? He says you're being very reasonable. Bella continued, leaning against the marble counter. It's for the best, really. Bruno needs a partner who understands his world. No offense, but you're a bit simple for him. He needs someone who can help him run an empire. Sarah took a sip, the cool water soothing her dry throat. She turned to face Bella. You're right, Bella, Sarah said, a small, cryptic smile playing on her lips. Bruno definitely needs someone who understands who really owns the empire. Bella frowned, confused. What does that mean? You'll see, Sarah said. Enjoy the party tonight. I hear it's going to be unforgettable. As Sarah walked away, Catherine intercepted her in the hallway. I don't want to see you tonight, Catherine hissed, grabbing Sarah's arm. You stay in your room. If I see one hair of yours downstairs while the Sinclairs are here, I will have security throw you out on the street tonight. Do you understand? Sarah looked at Catherine's hand on her arm. In the past, she would have flinched. She would have apologized. Instead, Sarah slowly reached out and removed Catherine's hand, gripping the older woman's wrist with surprising strength. She leaned in close. Be careful, Catherine, Sarah whispered. You're squeezing the hand that feeds you. She dropped Catherine's hand and walked up the stairs, leaving her mother-in-law stunned and speechless in the hallway. The Harrington Winter Gala was the crown jewel of the Newport social calendar. The estate's ballroom was transformed into a winter wonderland. Crystal chandeliers dripped with diamonds. White roses covered every surface, and a string quartet played soft classical music in the corner. By 8 p.m. the room was filled with the elite. Senators, CEOs, socialites, and old money dynasties mingled sipping champagne that cost more than most people's cars. Preston Harrington stood by the entrance, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was sweating. Every time the door opened, he flinched, expecting the executioner from Blackwood Equity. "Stop fidgeting," Catherine whispered harshly, standing beside him in a silver sequined gown. "You look guilty." "Where is he?" Preston muttered. "The letter said the representative would be here by 8. If he exposes the loan before I get Richard Sinclair to sign the merger papers—" "He won't," Catherine assured him. "We'll charm him. We'll stall him. Just focus on Richard." Across the room, Bruno stood with Bella. Bella was wearing a striking red dress, clearly designed to be the center of attention. She had her hand on Bruno's chest, laughing loudly at something a senator said. Bruno looked miserable. He kept scanning the room, his eyes darting to the staircase, as if hoping Sarah would appear, yet terrified that she might. At 8:15 p.m., the heavy double doors at the top of the grand staircase opened. Usually the guests wouldn't notice a late arrival, but the silence that rippled through the room started near the stairs and spread outward like a wave. The string quartet actually faltered for a beat. Standing at the top of the stairs was a woman. She was wearing midnight blue velvet that seemed to absorb the light. Diamonds, real heavy, flawless diamonds, glittered at her throat and ears. Her hair, usually tied back in a messy bun, fell in sleek, dark waves around her shoulders. Her makeup was sharp, accentuating eyes that looked like flint. It took the room a full 10 seconds to realize who it was. "Is that—" someone whispered. "Is that the waitress? My God, look at those diamonds!" Sarah didn't look down. She didn't look nervous. She looked like she owned the oxygen in the room. She began to descend the stairs. Click, click, click. Her heels on the marble were the only sound in the cavernous hall. Preston's jaw dropped. Catherine gasped, clutching her pearls. "What is she doing?" Catherine hissed. "I told her to stay in her room." Bruno turned. When he saw her, the champagne glass in his hand tilted spilling liquid onto the floor, but he didn't notice. He had never seen this woman before. He knew his wife, the quiet, mousy girl in cardigans. He did not know this queen. Sarah reached the bottom of the stairs. The crowd parted for her, instinctively making a path. She didn't walk toward Bruno. She didn't walk toward the bar. She walked straight toward Preston and Catherine. Arthur Pendleton stepped out from the crowd, wearing a tuxedo, and fell into step beside her. Catherine recovered first. Her shock turned to rage. She marched forward to intercept Sarah before she could reach the center of the room. "You insolent little—" Catherine seethed, keeping her voice low so the guests wouldn't hear. "Get upstairs, now! You are making a scene. You are embarrassing us." Sarah stopped. She looked at Catherine with an expression of mild amusement. "Hello, Catherine," Sarah said, her voice projecting perfectly. "You seem stressed. Is the party not going as planned?" "Security," Preston barked, waving at a burly man in the corner. "Escort her out. She is not on the guest list." The security guard hesitated. He looked at Preston, then he looked at Arthur Pendleton. Arthur held up a hand. "Actually, Mr. Harrington, she is on the guest list. In fact, she is the guest of honor." "What are you talking about?" Preston spat. "Who are you?" "I am Arthur Pendleton, legal counsel for Blackwood Equity." Preston's face went white. The blood drained from him so fast, he looked like a corpse. "Blackwood, you are the representative." "I am the counsel," Arthur corrected. He turned slightly and gestured to Sarah. "This is the representative, and the sole owner of Blackwood Equity." The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear a pin drop on the carpet. Preston blinked. "Sarah, that's impossible. She's nobody." Sarah stepped closer. The gap between them was only a few feet, but it felt like a canyon. "You called me useless, Preston," Sarah said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that terrified him. "You said I brought nothing to this family. You said I was a liability." She reached into her clutch and pulled out a folded document. It was the foreclosure notice. "It turns out," she continued, "I am the only thing keeping a roof over your head. I own your debt, Preston. I own the mortgage on this house. I own the liens on your factories. I own you." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The Sinclairs standing nearby looked horrified. Richard Sinclair slowly took a step away from Preston. "This is a joke," Bruno stammered, stepping forward. He looked at Sarah with wide, pleading eyes. "Sarah, honey, what is this?" "Tell them it's a joke." Sarah looked at her husband. For the first time in years, she felt nothing for him. No love, no pity, just a cold detachment. "It's not a joke, Bruno," she said. "It's business, and right now business is bad." Catherine was trembling. You tricked us. You lied." "I didn't lie," Sarah said. "I just didn't speak. You never let me speak, remember? You were too busy telling me I wasn't good enough." She turned to the crowd, addressing the Newport elite. "I apologize for the interruption," Sarah said smoothly. "But it seems the Harringtons have been hosting this party on borrowed time. And borrowed dimes." She turned back to Preston. "Mr. Harrington, per the terms of your agreement with Blackwood Equity, your loan is in default. We have a meeting scheduled right now." "Not here," Preston begged, sweat pouring down his face. "Please, Sarah, not in front of everyone." "Why not?" Sarah asked, tilting her head. "You had no problem humiliating me in front of everyone at dinner last Tuesday. You had no problem humiliating me in front of the Sinclairs." She glanced at Bella Sinclair. Bella looked small. The red dress suddenly looked tacky compared to Sarah's regal velvet. "But," Sarah sighed, "I have more class than you do. We can use the library." Sarah turned and began to walk toward the library doors. "Arthur, bring the paperwork. Preston, Catherine, bring your checkbook, though I doubt it will help." She stopped and looked back at Bruno. He was standing there, paralyzed. "You too, Bruno," she said. "You're going to want to hear this. It concerns your inheritance, or rather, the lack of it." As Sarah walked into the library, the heavy doors closing behind her, the ballroom erupted into chaos. The whispers turned into shouts. The mask of the Harrington family had been ripped off, and underneath there was nothing but rot. Inside the library, the air was thick with the scent of old leather and impending doom. Sarah sat in Preston's favorite leather chair, behind the massive oak desk. It was a power move, and she executed it perfectly. Preston, Catherine, and Bruno stood on the other side of the desk like naughty school children. "Sit," Sarah commanded. They sat. Arthur laid the files out on the desk. "As of midnight tonight, the grace period ends. The total outstanding debt, including penalties and interest, is $185 million. Preston put his head in his hands. "We don't have it." "Sarah, you know we don't have it. We need the Sinclair merger." "The Sinclair merger is dead," Sarah said coldly. "I saw Richard Sinclair leaving as I walked in here. He's not going to tie his fortune to a sinking ship." "You ruined us," Catherine shrieked, tears streaming down her face. "You ungrateful, spiteful little wretch." "We gave you a home. You gave me a room," Sarah corrected. "And you treated me like a servant in it. But let's be clear, Catherine. I didn't ruin you. You ruined yourselves. You spent money you didn't have to impress people who don't care about you. You stole from your employees." Preston's head snapped up. "You know, I know everything," Sarah said. "I have the pension fund audits." Preston looked like he was having a heart attack. "If you release those, you go to jail," Sarah finished, "and the Harrington name becomes synonymous with fraud." Bruno reached across the desk, trying to grab her hand. Sarah pulled back as if he were contagious. "Sarah," Bruno cried, "we're married. We're a team. You can't do this to your own husband." "Husband?" Sarah laughed. "The husband who was going to separate from me next week. The husband who let his mistress insult me in my own kitchen this morning. You aren't a husband, Bruno. You're a coward." She stood up, towering over them. "Here is the deal," Sarah said. "I have two options for you. Option A, I foreclose immediately. I seize the house, the cars, the company. I release the audit on the pension fund. Preston goes to prison. You are all on the street by morning." Catherine sobbed. Bruno looked sick. "What is option B?" Preston whispered, his voice broken. Sarah smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Option B," she said, "is that you sign everything over to me, willingly. The company, the estate, the assets. You resign from the board, Preston. You too, Catherine. You leave Newport. And Bruno," she looked at him, "you sign the divorce papers. Uncontested. No alimony. You leave with what you came with, which, according to my calculations, is nothing. If you do this," Sarah continued, "I will cover the pension fund hole with my own money. I will keep Preston out of jail. You won't leave with dignity, but you will leave with your freedom." The room was silent for a long time. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly. Tick, tock, tick, tock. "You have 5 minutes to decide," Sarah said, checking her diamond watch. "The guests are waiting for a toast. I'd like to give them one." The library door opened, but only Sarah walked out. The ballroom, which had been buzzing with fervent gossip, fell silent instantly. Hundreds of eyes fixed on her. Sarah didn't shrink. She didn't look back at the broken family inside the library. She walked to the center of the room, signaled the band to stop, and took a microphone from the stage. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice steady and clear. "The Harringtons have asked me to convey their apologies. They have been called away on urgent family business. As the new majority shareholder of Harrington Steel and the owner of this estate, I invite you to enjoy the rest of the evening." A gasp ripped through the room. Waiters froze with trays of champagne. Sarah signaled the band leader. "Please continue. I believe we were celebrating a new chapter." She handed the microphone back and walked straight toward the bar. She didn't look for approval. She didn't need it. Inside the library, the scene was one of utter devastation. Preston sat slumped in his chair, a pen lying next to the signed deed of transfer. He looked 20 years older than he had an hour ago. Catherine was weeping into a silk handkerchief, her makeup running in dark streaks down her face. Bruno was staring out the window at the dark lawn, his hands shaking. "She took it all," Catherine moaned. "My house, my garden, my mother's antiques." "Technically," Arthur Pendleton said, gathering the papers into his briefcase, "those antiques were purchased with company funds in 2018, so they are corporate assets, which now belong to Mrs. Blackwood Harrington." "Don't call her that," Bruno snapped, spinning around. "She's Sarah. She's my Sarah." "Not any more, Mr. Harrington," Arthur said, sliding a single document toward Bruno. "This is the divorce decree. Sign here here and here. And please leave the keys to the Porsche on the desk. That vehicle is leased under the company name." Bruno looked at the keys in his hand, the symbol of his status, the car he drove to the country club to impress Bella. He slammed them onto the desk. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Bruno spat at the lawyer. "I am enjoying justice, sir," Arthur replied calmly. "It is a rare commodity these days." The next morning, the exodus began. It was a grey, drizzly day in Newport. There were no moving trucks. Sarah had given them strict instructions. They could take only personal clothing and items that were not purchased with company funds or listed as collateral. Catherine walked out the front door carrying 2 Louis Vuitton suitcases. "Stop," Arthur said, standing by the trunk of a modest rental car. "Open the suitcases, please." "This is an outrage," Catherine screamed. "You want to search my underwear. I want to ensure you aren't removing company property," Arthur said. "Mrs. Blackwood Harrington was very specific about the jewelry." Catherine popped the latches. Inside, nestled among the silk blouses, was a velvet box containing a diamond necklace, the Harrington heirloom. Arthur reached in and took the box. "This was listed as an asset in the 2020 refinancing deal. It stays." Catherine lunged for it, but Arthur stepped back. "Mrs. Harrington, do not make me call the police. Remember the pension fund." Catherine froze. The threat of prison was the only leash that held her. She slammed the suitcase shut. Her face twisted in pure hatred. Preston came out next, carrying a box of files. He looked hollow. The power that had defined him was gone. He was just an old man with bad knees and a gambling addiction. Then came Bruno. He walked out wearing jeans and a hoodie, carrying a duffel bag. He looked up at the house, the mansion he had grown up, in the birthright he thought was guaranteed. He saw Sarah standing in the second-floor window. She was drinking coffee, watching them. Bruno dropped his bag and walked to the spot beneath the window. "Sarah," he shouted. "Sarah, please, talk to me." Sarah opened the window. The cold wind blew her hair back. She looked down at him like a queen, looking at a peasant. "What is it?" "Bruno. I'm sorry," he yelled, rain starting to wet his face. "I was weak. I was scared of my father. But I love you. You can't just throw me out like this. Where will I go?" "I hear Bella is staying at the Ritz," Sarah said calmly. "Maybe she has a couch." "Bella doesn't want me," Bruno cried. "She left this morning. She blocked my number." "Imagine that," Sarah said. "She only wanted you for your money. How does it feel, Bruno? To be valued only for what you can provide, to be discarded when you're no longer useful." Bruno fell to his knees on the wet gravel. "I have nothing, Sarah. You have your freedom," she said. "Risk it to become a better man, but you'll do it somewhere else." She closed the window and drew the curtains. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind for the business world. The headlines were relentless. Harrington Empire crumbles mystery. Heiress takes control. The waitress who foreclosed on Newport. Pension scandal averted. New owner plugs $12 million hole. Sarah didn't hide in the shadows anymore. She stepped into the light. On her first day as CEO of what was now rebranded as Blackwood Steel, she walked into the corporate headquarters. The lobby was silent. The employees were terrified. They had heard the rumors of the ruthless takeover. They expected mass firings. Sarah walked to the elevator, Arthur by her side. She was wearing a tailored grey suit, her hair sharp and professional. She called an all-hands meeting in the auditorium. 300 employees sat in nervous silence. Sarah stood at the podium. She didn't use notes. "My name is Sarah Blackwood," she began. "For the last 2 years, I was the woman who brought coffee to the board meetings. I was the woman ignored in the hallway. I heard what was said when the Harringtons weren't listening. I know who works late. I know who covers for the incompetent managers. I know who actually runs this company." She looked around the room. "The Harringtons treated this company as their personal piggy bank. They stole from your pension fund to pay for their yachts. That ends today." A murmur went through the crowd. "I have replenished the pension fund with my own private capital," Sarah announced. "Your retirements are safe." The silence broke. People looked at each other, stunned. Someone started clapping, then another. Soon the room was roaring with applause. "However," Sarah raised a hand, "changes are coming. I am clearing out the C-suite. The nepotism is over. If you have a job here, it's because you're good at it, not because you play golf with Preston Harrington." Over the next month, Sarah cleaned house. She fired the CFO, who had helped Preston cook the books. She fired the VP of sales, who spent more time in strip clubs than client meetings. She promoted the quiet, hard-working, mid-level managers she had observed for years. She was efficient, fair, and terrifyingly competent. The useless art history major turned out to have a steel trap for a mind. She understood people, and in business, that was everything. But the past wasn't done with her yet. One evening, Sarah was working late in her office, Preston's old office, now redecorated with modern art and clean lines. The intercom buzzed. "Ms. Blackwood," the security guard said, "there is a woman here to see you. She says it's urgent. A Mrs. Catherine Harrington." Sarah paused, her pen hovering over a contract. She hadn't seen Catherine in 6 weeks. Rumor had it they were living in a small 2-bedroom apartment in a run-down part of Providence. "Send her up," Sarah said. Minutes later, Catherine walked in. She looked different. Her hair was graying at the roots. Her clothes were wrinkled, and the arrogant sneer was gone, replaced by a look of desperate exhaustion. She stood awkwardly in front of the desk. Sarah didn't offer her a seat. "What do you want, Catherine?" We need help," Catherine stammered. It clearly physically hurt her to ask. "Preston is sick. The stress. His heart. We don't have insurance anymore. The hospital bills." "You want money?" Sarah said flatly. "I want a loan," Catherine corrected, trying to salvage a shred of dignity. "Just until Preston gets back on his feet." "He won't get back on his feet, Catherine. He's finished." Sarah stood up and walked to the window looking out over the city lights. "You know," Sarah said softly, "when my mother got sick, I asked you for help. Do you remember? It was right after I married Bruno. She needed a specialist. It would have cost you less than one of your handbags." Catherine went pale. I didn't know it was that serious." "You said," Sarah turned her eyes blazing on her. "We don't support handouts for poor relations. You let her die in a county hospital, Catherine." Catherine looked down at the floor. "I'm sorry." "No, you're not," Sarah said. "You're just broke." Sarah walked back to her desk and wrote a check. She ripped it out and slid it across the mahogany surface. "Take it." Catherine looked at the check. Her eyes widened. It was for $50,000. This is for the doctors," Sarah said. "Not for you. If I find out you spent a dime of this on anything else, I will ruin whatever life you have left. Do you understand?" Catherine nodded, clutching the check. "Thank you. Thank you, Sarah." "Get out," Sarah said. Catherine turned to leave. At the door, she stopped. "Bruno, he asks about you. Every day." "Tell him to stop," Sarah said, returning to her paperwork. "He had his chance." As the door clicked shut, Sarah put down her pen. Her hand was trembling slightly. It wasn't fear. It was the adrenaline of closure. She had faced the monster under her bed, and she had pitied it. She picked up her phone and dialed Arthur. "It's done," she said. "They came begging." "And," Arthur asked. "I gave them enough to survive," she said, "but not enough to live." "You're a better person than I am." Arthur laughed. "No," Sarah said, looking at the photo of her mother she kept on her desk. "I'm just done being the victim. Now, Arthur, tell me about the Sinclair acquisition." Arthur paused. "You want to buy the Sinclair Group?" Richard Sinclair turned his back on the Harringtons because they were sinking. Sarah said, a shark-like smile appearing on her face. "But rumor has it his own development projects are over-leveraged. I think it's time Blackwood Steel expanded into real estate." "You want to take down the Sinclairs too?" "They insulted me at dinner," Sarah said, standing up and grabbing her coat. "I have a long memory, Arthur. Prepare the offer. Hostile takeover." 3 months later, the ballroom of the Boston Harbor Hotel was packed with the sharks of the East Coast property market. It was the annual New England Real Estate Summit. Richard Sinclair stood at the front of the room, sweating under the stage lights. Beside him stood Bella, looking bored and checking her phone. The Sinclair Group was pitching a massive new waterfront development, a project Richard desperately needed to secure investors for. Rumors had been circling that the Sinclair Group was cash poor, having overextended on luxury condos in Miami that weren't selling. "This development?" Richard boomed into the microphone, pointing to a sleek architectural rendering will redefine luxury living. "We are looking for a strategic partner to join us for a buy-in of $50 million. The room was quiet. $50 million was a lot of money, especially when everyone knew Richard was desperate. Suddenly a voice cut through the silence from the back of the room. "I'll take it, but not as a partner." Heads turned. Chairs scraped against the floor. Sarah Blackwood walked down the center aisle. She was flanked by Arthur Pendleton and 2 other severe-looking attorneys. She wore a white suit, sharp, pristine, and undeniable. She looked like a white knight who had come not to save the dragon, but to slay it. Richard Sinclair squinted against the lights. "Sarah." "What are you doing here? This is a closed summit." "I purchased a seat," Sarah said, stopping in the middle of the room. "Actually, I purchased the entire front row." She gestured for her lawyers to sit, but she remained standing. "You're looking for $50 million, Richard?" Sarah asked, her voice projecting clearly without a microphone. "That's funny. Because according to my analysis of your quarterly earnings, $50 million is exactly the amount of debt you have maturing next week with the Sovereign Bank." Richard's face flushed red. "That is confidential financial information. Not when you're publicly traded," Sarah countered smoothly. "And not when I've already bought the debt from the bank." Bella dropped her phone. She stared at Sarah, her mouth slightly open. "What?" Richard stammered. You bought the debt?" "I did," Sarah said, stepping closer to the stage. Sovereign Bank was happy to offload a high-risk loan. "Which means, Richard, you don't need a partner. You need a boss." She signaled Arthur, who stood up, and handed a thick document to Richard on the edge of the stage. "This is a tender offer," Sarah announced to the room. "Blackwood Steel is diversifying. We are offering to acquire the Sinclair Group for $12 a share. That's a 20% premium over your current sinking stock price." The room erupted. It was a hostile takeover executed in broad daylight. "I will never sell to you," Richard shouted. You're a nobody. A waitress." "I am the woman who owns your mortgage." Sarah corrected her voice, ice cold. If you refuse the offer, I call in the debt next week. You default. You go into bankruptcy, and the shareholders get nothing. Or you sign, you walk away rich, and I take the company." She looked at the audience of investors. "I think your board of directors would prefer the payout." Richard looked at the crowd. He saw the hungry eyes of his investors. He knew he was beaten. He slumped visibly, the fight draining out of him. Bella rushed to the edge of the stage. "You can't do this. My father built this company. It's my legacy." Sarah looked at Bella, the girl who had sneered at her in the kitchen, the girl who had tried to steal her husband for sport. "Legacy is earned, Bella," Sarah said softly. "It's not given. And frankly, you're not qualified to run a lemonade stand, let alone a development firm." Sarah turned her back on them. "You have 24 hours to sign Richard. Arthur will handle the details." As she walked out of the summit, the press was waiting. Cameras flashed, blinding and chaotic. "Ms. Blackwood. Ms. Blackwood, is it true you've acquired the Harrington estate and the Sinclair Group in less than 6 months? Ms. Blackwood, what do you have to say to your critics?" Sarah stopped at her car. The driver opened the door. She looked back at the hotel, then at the reporters. "Tell them," Sarah said, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips, "that the useless girl has been very busy." She got into the car. "Where to, Ms. Blackwood?" the driver asked. Sarah looked out the window at the city passing by. She thought of Bruno somewhere in a small apartment learning to live with his choices. She thought of Preston and Catherine, humbled and powerless. She thought of her grandfather Silas, who had given her the sword, and her mother who had given her the strength to wield it. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't sad. She was free. "Take me to the library," Sarah said. "I have some books to return." And that is how Sarah Miller, the woman they laughed at, the wife they called useless, became the queen of the very empire that tried to crush her. In the end, the Harringtons and the Sinclairs lost everything, not because Sarah was cruel, but because they were arrogant. They forgot the most important rule of life. Be careful who you step on today, because they might be the one holding your safety net tomorrow. Sarah didn't just inherit billions. She inherited her self-worth. She walked away, not just with the money, but with her dignity intact, proving that the best revenge isn't screaming, it's succeeding. What a ride. I want to know what you would have done in Sarah's shoes. Would you have given the Harringtons that $50,000 for the hospital bills? Or would you have let them suffer like they let her mother suffer? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice and karma, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next part of our Revenge and Redemption series. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.